So in the last video, I spoke about spiritual anxiety or anxiety over meaninglessness. Today I want to talk about what Paul Tillich terms ontic anxiety or anxiety over death. Okay, so death is both the creator and the destroyer of meaning. How does death create meaning for us? Well, whenever I read Homer's Iliad, I'm always struck by a really funny episode in which Ares, the god of war, decides to join human battle. Now he's on top of Mount Olympus and he's looking down at the Greeks and the Trojans fighting it out, and he's filled with envy. In particular, he's watching Diomedes, who's killing Trojans by the dozens. It's not right, it's not fair, Ares reasons, that a mere mortal is able to shine so brightly. So Ares disguises himself as a human being and flies down from Mount Olympus and starts to fight with Diomedes. Now Diomedes is ignorant that he's dueling a god, but he stabs Ares in the leg, at which point Ares drops his disguise, screams out in pain, and flies back to Mount Olympus to lick his wounds. Now this divine human encounter illustrates, I think, the primary advantage that we humans have over the gods. When we step onto a field of battle, we are able to embody courage in a way that they never can. Why? Because we risk our lives, because we put it all on the line. But Ares, a god of war, he is so OP that when he steps onto a field of battle, he risks nothing. His participation in fighting, it looks more like a farce than an epic. You know, if you were ever to encounter somebody who truly had nothing to lose, then that person could never demonstrate to themselves or to the rest of us what it is that they really value. So Martin Hagglund makes this very point in a recent book when he writes, "I must live in relation to my irrevocable death. Otherwise, I would believe that my time is infinite, and there would be no urgency in dedicating my life to anything." In other words, we care because the projects and the relationships that we sustain are, like our very lives, vulnerable to loss and to ruin. You know, it doesn't make sense, for example, to invent a sport that theoretically has no ending in sight. I'm looking at you, J.K. Rowling. Quidditch doesn't make sense. Sorry. Without being bound by death, our choices would be inconsequential. This is what Martin Heidegger calls authentic being towards death. So that's how death creates meaning in our lives, but also death is the destroyer of meaning. Because one day I'm not going to be able to commit my life to anything. This is what Ernest Becker calls the existential paradox. And this is how he describes it. Man has a symbolic identity that brings him sharply out of nature. He's a creature with a name, a life history. He's a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity, who can place himself imaginatively at a point in space and contemplate bemusedly his own planet. This immense expansion, this dexterity, this ethereality, this self-consciousness gives to man the status of a small god in nature, as the Renaissance thinkers knew. Yet at the same time, as the Eastern sages also knew, man is a worm and food for worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual, up in the stars and housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body that once belonged to a fish and still has the gill marks to prove it. His body is a material, fleshy casing that's alien to him in many ways. The strangest and most repugnant way being that it aches and bleeds and will decay and die. So on the one hand, we see that without death our lives would be meaningless. But on the other hand, we fear that because of death, our lives might be meaningless. With the inevitable death of our planet, of our solar system, of our galaxy, followed by the inevitable death of all of the stars, we might ask ourselves, what is the ultimate point? Now, I understand that many people do not see death as the end of life. Some people believe that the soul is immortal, that death actually as a concept doesn't exist. Others believe that at the time of death, our consciousness returns to the supreme consciousness. And there are still others that believe that death, when properly understood, isn't actually the problem, but rather it's the solution to the problem. And I'm not discounting any of these spiritual teachings as meaningful possibilities. But I do doubt that most people are so convinced by their spiritual teaching that they're unafraid of death. If not for themselves, then at least for their loved ones. Besides, somebody looking for an existentialist viewpoint wants to take a stand on this life. But what does that stand look like? So let's talk about what doesn't work. We're not going to take one of the factors in this paradox and run to it as our hope, like rationality, for example, as the Stoics did, or the emotions, as the Romantics did. We're not going to place all of our hope in the body, as many in the 1960s did. And finally, and maybe most controversially, we can't put all of our hope in the community or in history, as certain political philosophies prescribe. All of these are a part of a meaningful life, but none of them ultimately solve the problem of death. It's still looming in the background. In this way, I think we have a lot to learn from Marshall Lineman and dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. Now, DBT talks about the dialectic in a peculiar way. It's not Hegel's dialectic, where you have a thesis and then an antithesis and they resolve into a synthesis. Now, there's no resolution in the DBT dialectic. Rather, I learned to take a stand in the both and. Then here's an example of what that might look like. I both want to eat an ice cream cone and I want to lose weight. Both can be true and neither need to be discounted. As that relates to the existential paradox, I both want to live a finite, meaningful life, and I want my life and my relationships and my projects to continue on. In other words, I want to accept my death, and I want to not accept my death. The French philosopher Pascal seems to have anticipated this both and stance when he wrote, "We do not display greatness by going to one extreme, but by touching both at once and filling all the intervening space." This means that I refrain from committing to a solution to my death and rather learn to live with my death as an insoluble problem, to carry it with me always. In this way, I can follow both the French essayist Montaigne as well as the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. On the one hand, to study philosophy is to learn how to die. And on the other hand, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. The wonderful irony of learning to live with my death is that then all of the factors, rationality, the emotions, the body, the community, history, they're able to come back to me renewed. So that's my video on death anxiety. In the description below, I've left a list of books that I can think of right now that help me think about death. Please leave a comment. What is it that you are doing right now to prepare for your death, and what place does your death occupy in your life? Thanks.